College football nerds here to give you a little game review of a pretty important and fun game to watch, Clemson and Ohio State. Ohio State fans, I hope you are with us on this one. I know it's a tough loss for y'all, but there was a lot of good to glean from this game, and so I hope some of y'all are here. And if you are, make sure and get at us in the comments. Want to remind everybody, y'all should be liked and subscribed at this point, but please do so if you haven't. And this will be in audio form on our podcast version, iTunes, Android, yada, yada, yada. All right, Josh, so let's start positive for both teams. We're not known to do that, but I'd like to. So I want to talk about what our positive takeaways were from this, and we're going to get into the refs and the momentum swings and the things that we didn't love so much later in the video. But tell me kind of what your takeaways were, and you do Clemson and I'll do Ohio State. What were your takeaways for Clemson in this game that surprised you in a positive way?
The biggest thing that really surprised me was Trevor Lawrence as a runner. Lawrence was very effective running the football in a way that we really hadn't seen before. As long going into this game, I believe was a 20-yard carry. So it's not like Lawrence had been used as a primary runner. I know everyone knew he was a good athlete. Everybody knew he could run, but it never really been a real function of the offense. They had been using Etienne and then, either Etienne or using the vertical passing game. I think Clemson maybe at times had to figure out ways to get around the fact that Ross and Higgins were in and out of the lineup. That always messes with, at the very least, what your game plan is. And the fact that they were able to really lean on Lawrence as a runner to generate a 6.7 yard per attempt average, with him as a runner is really impressive. And I think that was a huge sort of unknown thing or unknown ability that I don't think there's any doubt really helped Clemson win this game.
Yeah, and we've all known that Trevor Lawrence is an athlete, and we've even seen him catch teams with their pants down when he keeps the ball in a zone read, because he's, one might think that he does it so few times that that's the surprise factor, but he is a legit athlete. I mean, you see some of the hits he took last night, and it shows that not only is he an athlete, but he's willing to get his head in there and get a hit and keep on trucking. For me, it was also the running game. I loved, and I've been saying this all year, J.K. Dobbins is my favorite running back in the country this year. I've been on it for a couple of weeks now, dating back to the first Wisconsin game, actually. I didn't think he was getting enough love given all the other Hubbard and Taylor noise out there. And he didn't just step up in this game. He was effective in a way that I think Ohio State really needed him to be. You pointed out in a tweet, we both talked about it on Slack before you tweeted it. I think we said it to each other at the same time. There was a long run that Justin Fields had in this game that led to a score or a field goal or something. That it was pretty clear that he was still not 100%. I think it was obvious. I think that it took a lot out of their offensive strategy of what they could do, because he could not run up in north and south. It just wasn't there. His normal speed wasn't there. He still had decent agility in the pocket. J.K. Dobbins was that comfort blanket of needing not just a first down, not just to catch out of the backfield, but big plays at crucial points to get them going early. My other pleasant surprise in this game, I'm going to not eat a little crow, but I'm going to say that one of my question marks in this game was if Justin Fields is not 100% with his leg, can he throw the ball? And we didn't know. It was a question mark for us. Not just that we knew he's a good quarterback. The guy's up there in the Heisman talk. We knew he was a good quarterback. But we didn't know how he could do it against a top-notch defense if his legs weren't there, if that part of the offense wasn't there, and they had to scheme around his arm. And he really stepped up, better than I thought, especially early on. And some of the red zone stubbing of their toe was their own doing, and some of it was Clemson's, but it wasn't because of Fields. He was really there. So tell me then, in this game, again, we'll talk about the ref stuff in a little bit, but we said coming into this game that Clemson could still be an elite team and not have played anybody all year. And clearly we still think that they're an elite team now that they've played somebody. And we said that Ohio State had some question marks about having not played a top flight passing attack or a top flight offense. Is it safe to say in your mind that both of these teams sort of put the question marks to bed about the teams they played, and irrespective of whether they played good teams or not, they're both, elite programs on both sides of the ball?
I think so. And I think you saw both sides of the coin when you're questioning competition level. The positive side to it, or I'll say the side that maybe makes people more happy to talk about, is they both stepped up. They both looked like they belonged. They were both very physical. There was no question that Clemson's competition level is very poor, and I think it's continuing to prove itself out in the bowl period. But that's not a reflection on Clemson. We said that all year long, over and over again. Clemson definitely looks like they belong, not just in terms of their ability to score, but like you talked about with Trevor Lawrence taking hit after hit and continuing to run. Their size and physicality was not grossly outmatched by Ohio State by any measure. They were able to stand there and, be able to win, if not every time, they were able to win enough battles in the line of scrimmage. They were able to win battles in the secondary. They belonged in this game. And I think the same was true of Ohio State. We had question marks on both sides of the ball. I'll say a positive for Ohio State. We had question marks about their ability to defend the vertical pass based off the competition level in the Big Ten. They didn't really get beat too badly by the vertical pass at any point in this game. Most of the bigger plays were actually shorter plays that turned into long ones. I will say there's a little bit of a genuine asterisk there because Ross and Higgins were in and out of the lineup a lot. And they were never, they were pretty much able to bracket one or the other because they weren't both healthy at the same time. But, even outside that fact, they still never really got anything going downfield. So I do think both these teams did absolutely belong. And then I'll flip it over though and say one thing that we flagged and then sort of noted the competition level may be masking. Travis Etienne had a long history that we pointed out repeatedly. We pointed out in the Land Grant Holy Grand podcast of not really performing at a high level in these top level games. That did continue in this game. So the competition level, we were right, did affect some things. The most notable thing I would say going into it, Clemson's run game outside Lawrence was not effective. Now, Lawrence was effective in a positive spot, but Etienne did kind of not show up in the game outside. I know he had the huge catch and run, which was very important as a receiver, but his long running the ball was 8 yards. I mean, he had 36 yards and 10 carries, 3.6 yards per attempt. We flagged that as something that had happened in the past. He had been gangbusters all year. People were laughing at us for saying we thought Dobbins may be the better back in this game. But I do think we were correct that the competition level had really made the Clemson run game look like something it quite wasn't, whereas the Ohio State game did show up and looked a lot like the Ohio State run game for most of the year.
Since I'm all about us taking victory laps on things we went on a limb and projected and got right, I want to talk a little bit about how accurate we were in this game. And we're called homers, this and that all the time. We got called Ohio State homers a lot this week, which is super rich given our origins. But I predicted this game 21-26 Clemson. You predicted it 31-28 Ohio State. The model had it 28-27 Clemson. The final score was 29-23. That's a lot of numbers. We do that sometimes, y'all. We reel off numbers and it sounds bad all in a row. But the final point spread was 6. I had it at 5. All over the actual, where the score was going to land too. Because people will remember, Ohio State had a chance to score on that last drive. Had they scored, the game would have been 30-29, and you predicted 31-28. We were all over this game, and I'm not saying that to really pat ourselves on the back, even though I said it was a victory lap. I'm saying it to say that the point spread was close too. A lot of the feeling on both sides of the ball, or both fan bases, was that this game was going to be super tight. And it's interesting because we have this LSU Oklahoma data point where it was just an absolute blowout. But it's funny because I don't get the feeling coming out of this game that Clemson's automatically even should be this 3.5 point underdog. Is it fair to say that this game being a tight game really has no bearing on the next game that's played? And in your mind, Clemson might even still be a favorite?
I don't think it does have any real bearing. And there's an irony that Clemson fans have been sort of defending themselves for playing a weak schedule all year. And now they're going to be in a position where they had an extremely hard game. That's the most impressive win probably of anyone in college football, right? Clemson beating Ohio State. I don't think there's any question of it. LSU over healthier Alabama is the number 2, but this was a bigger win. And winning by 6 points in a game like this is a really big deal. Now the problem becomes you can start nitpicking, well, they only scored 29 points. Well, they had these rush numbers, they had these pass numbers. Just appearing competent when you're playing someone like Ohio State is really freaking hard. And I don't know that the point margin against Oklahoma is going to be anywhere near as relevant or important as any of the stats generated in this Ohio State game. But there's also going to be a lot of stuff where they struggled, and we'll talk about that in a minute, different things where both these teams had maybe had issues, or I would say break points, right? Things where Ohio State was able to limit you in this way because they're just really stinking good. And Clemson was able to limit Ohio State because they're really stinking good in this other way, and that caused the game to turn out the way it did. Those data points, don't just sit there and compare them and say, well, that didn't happen to LSU. LSU didn't play Ohio State. It's a one-off. It's the exact opposite of the rest of the season. This is one that you have to be careful and hyper-analyzing because you played an elite opponent that can make you look bad in ways that no one else, literally no one else in the country can do. And so, yeah, I mean, it's probably more interesting stats, but you have to be a little careful, as much as even we say it, in assuming that just because it's a really good game, that these stats are actually genuinely more useful than a blowout. Playing the number 1 team can be sometimes as deceptive as playing the number 130 team, because both those teams can make you look statistically, bad in one case or awesome in another case, in an equally deceptive manner.
It's interesting because we've talked about a couple of concepts this year repeatedly. One, that we think there's a huge drop off between the top 3 or 4 teams for when Alabama and Tua were healthy, to that next level of teams. And that next level of teams, which is where LSU was facing an opponent in that next group of teams, is where you hit these lack of scaling issues, or the ability to scale because you're facing a defense or a team that's maybe not quite as good or a lot less good, that allows you the freedom offensively to do a lot of things that if you were facing an opponent that was just a little bit better on one side of the ball, it wouldn't be there. And I think that's what we saw with LSU Oklahoma versus Clemson and Ohio State. Talk about that for a minute.
I think maybe the biggest example when you're looking at these two games is the passing game. So in the Oklahoma game, and I don't want to belabor the point there too much. We'll talk about that preview in its own preview. If you're interested, we'll have a different video talking about that game. But Jalen Hurts is 7 yards per attempt. Joe Burrow is 12.5 yards per attempt. And Jalen Hurts had a pretty competent passing game. Burrow had an bonkers one. And once they crossed a certain threshold, LSU was able to go off. And even though Jalen Hurts was at 7 yards per attempt, it didn't really produce a lot. And why do I hit on that 7 yards per attempt number? Because it was the same, actually, that Justin Fields had in the Clemson game. And if you watch those two games back to back, I don't think you feel like the teams had anything resembling similar production from the passing game. I mean, but it actually wasn't that different. Justin Fields is 7 yards per attempt. He had a 54 quarterback QBR. I'm looking at the ESPN numbers. Jalen Hurts had a 7 yards per attempt, 40 QBR, 0 touchdown, 1 interception to 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. More yardage for Fields because he threw more passes, 30 to 46 versus 15 to 31. Much higher completion percentage for Fields, but much lower yard per completion number. I think what's interesting in those two games is, the production from both those quarterbacks isn't necessarily too dissimilar for their offenses in terms of points. Oklahoma scores 28, Ohio State scores 23. But the difference is what those 23 mean, how painful it is to get there, how painful it was for Oklahoma. I mean, you knew that Oklahoma was moving the ball some, and it felt like kind of a victory when they did, but it feels a lot more painful to watch a team get 23 when you're in a tight game where you know you need the points and where everything's, not going your way. So that's kind of one side of it, is how important the same number, or how different the same number can feel in a tighter game. And a lot of that was due, also, I'll say the flip side, the 7-yard per attempt number from Fields was enough to keep them in the game. And it's no shocker because they could hold on Clemson under 30 points. Fields' day looks like Hurts' day looked like an absolute disaster in large part because he gave up 63, and suddenly you're viewed on a different pedestal. But I'll also take this in one more direction, looking again at Ohio State specifically in that same number. 7 yards per attempt was the lowest yard per attempt total that Justin Fields had in any game this season, and the closest was 7.5 against Indiana. And that's maybe an interesting point. He was 65% passing, 7 yards per attempt against Clemson. Against Indiana, he's 58% passing and 7.4 yards per attempt. 320 yards against Clemson, 214 against Indiana. But he has 3 touchdowns against Indiana and only 1 against Clemson. And let me note, higher yard per attempt average, but just barely against Indiana, but significantly less yardage and a lower completion percentage. He threw more picks against Clemson, but the overall point there is his performance against Clemson statistically, not all that different. Just maybe slightly worse than his performance against Clemson in a lot of ways statistically. But the bigger deal was turnovers. The bigger deal was the way, the lack of explosive plays in particular in the passing game. Those things keep you from scoring points. And when you have to throw 46 passes to get to 320 yards, what it means is that you're not really ever breaking through and getting explosive plays. And explosive plays are how you score in the game of football. And that little statistical drop-off you see from a guy who had 9 yard per attempt average down to 7, that 2 out of 9 drop represented really the extra yards after catch, the downfield vertical plays, the scoring plays in particular. It was that lack of a breaking point, I think, that really hurt Ohio State and their ability to produce. And that's a reflection of how they did versus, how they would have done in a lot of other games versus, maybe how the Oklahoma game went, or how Burrow, who had no limiter on him, was able to do whatever he wanted.
So, Josh, we got to talk about this, and we're not one to talk about refereeing much. Ohio State fans have patiently waited for however long we've been recording to wait to hear us talk about this, because it does matter. And I want to have a discussion about a couple of calls without saying this cost or didn't cost Ohio State the game. Because Clemson fans are going to take this as, oh, well, you're in the tank for Ohio State and you're, explaining their loss away. I'm not, because I will also say this about bad calls. They're crushing. They can kill momentum, but there's also the rest of the game to play. It's one thing to have a terrible call at the end of the game that gives you a win versus something that you have enough time to make up for. So I want to frame this discussion in that context so the Clemson fans don't think that we're discrediting their win. They earned the win. They earned the win. But I also want to be empathetic to the Ohio State fans who really did feel what I think was at least one bad call. So 2 calls that I want to discuss, really the 2 biggest momentum swing calls: the targeting and the fumble. And I'm going to let you just kind of run wild on this, but I'll give you my opinion and you can tell me if you agree. Targeting by the rule and where we're at right now, the targeting was the right call. Whether or not the refs are kind of hamstrung because they have to call it by the rule is a different story. But based on what they had to call, the targeting was the right call. The fumble was an absolute, no explanation possible travesty of a call that completely got it wrong. Tell me what you think about those 2 and how you feel it impacted the game, and if you think it cost Ohio State the game.
So the first call, the targeting penalty, was the right call, and it seems like pretty much everybody's in agreement with that, according to the letter of the law and the rules. Now, there's something I really don't like about targeting, which is that they do nothing for the offensive player dropping his head. I get that, and I'm very sympathetic for it, and I'm frankly frustrated by it, because when you get guys that are coming in it's hard to tackle someone and not have your head somewhere in the way. And when an offensive player ducks his head, that opens it up. Now, that point taken, Wade drops his head. He doesn't just make helmet-to-helmet contact, in which case I'd have a stronger argument. He does actually make contact with the crown of his helmet, and you just can't do that. You cannot lower your face mask, particularly when going against a quarterback in the pocket. You are taught, you know this, and they instituted the play specifically to penalize you and teach you that your face mask has to stay up. You cannot drop the face mask and hit with the top of your helmet when you're hitting a quarterback in that situation. They're trying to teach you not to do it. That was the right call. Now that penalty, obviously really put Clemson back in the game, because at that point it's 16-0. Clemson gets the ball. They drive down the field. It's really painfully 3rd and 5 on that. So without it, it ends up being a really big negative play. Then they're going to end up having a punt, and then Ohio State has a chance to put the game away. But there's a couple things I'll take away in that particular drive. One, the penalty occurs at the Ohio State 45. So it's not as if Clemson hadn't moved the ball on that drive. They'd already moved it from their 25 to the Ohio State 45. So they moved it 30 yards on the drive. They're in Ohio State territory. And to a certain degree, that play doesn't necessarily kill you if you haven't let them get to there. And then if you don't let them get from the 30 and score a touchdown, which is the other half of it. It's not all in a vacuum. But I think that penalty in and of itself wasn't really the thing that I think everybody makes mad. I think a lot of people understand it. The bigger one was that the issue with the play where they overturned the fumble. And that one, I don't think there's any doubt that penalty was a lot more significant. Now, you and I are not completely in agreement on whether or not that was a completely blown, busted call. I think it was a bad call. I agree with you on that part. I don't think it was as horrendous as you, because when watched live, it's such a bang thing that he gets hit, he spins, he drops the ball. And in slow motion, you take the ball from over his head and he brings it to his chest and then it gets knocked out. But live, it's so fast, and it's so fast that the ball, he has it in his hands and it's out, that I get why they look at it live and say he never caught it. I mean, he has his hands and he had a motion where he brings it down, but that motion is, a tenth of a second. He never really gains control of the ball, and he's trying to tuck it. I still think on the whole, he really brings it down and then he goes to tuck it. Like, he brings it down, and I'll bring up a point you made, which is, if it's a score, or if they're in the end zone, does he score? I mean, that was the point that you made to me, and that's the thing that kind of persuaded me that probably is a bad call. Because I think when you watch it in slow motion, if it was in the end zone, I think they do roll it a touchdown. I think they say he's got control. At that point, the play's over, and then the ball gets knocked out. But, as it is, I get why you could overturn it, or let me put it this way, if it had been rolled the other way, I get why maybe you'd let it stand. But I don't understand why you overturn it, given the ruling on the field. I think that was a bad call. And that one was really damaging because, after that happens, they do end up scoring. They do end up, continuing to make a close game. So I think those penalties both matter. But can I throw out one more penalty for you that I think actually maybe did decide the game, just to point out that this game wasn't about just one or two particular things in isolation. It was the roughing the kicker call with 8 minutes and 30 seconds left in the third quarter. I think that roughing the kicker call is really what cost Ohio State the game. And the reason for that is it was 16-14 at that point in the game. It was 4th and 6 in the Clemson 15. Clemson had not moved the ball on that drive. They were deep in their own field position. And there was a blatant roughing the kicker that put them out to the 30-yard line. They had a 17-yard run, and then they dumped it off to Etienne, who ran 53 yards for a touchdown. If they just don't rough the kicker there, Ohio State is probably getting the ball at midfield, up 14-16 with a chance to go up by 2 scores, or at least go up, make it 19 so that Clemson, go up 19-14, Clemson scores 21, you can kick a field goal to take the lead again, and they're in a lot more control of that game. I think the roughing the kicker call, if you want to talk about a penalty or a breaking point, was probably more impactful than anything else in the game. And I will say, at least for my part, that's why I hate blaming the game on penalties or bad calls, because there were a lot of calls and a lot of things that decided this game. And to me, the most impactful one was a penalty that was gotten correctly that was completely unforced. So, yeah, if that fumble return doesn't go the way you think it is, maybe it changes the game. Now, granted, Clemson at the end of the game when they needed to score to win, scored to win with authority. And I don't know how Clemson responds if they knew they had to score in the second half because that play happens and they're in a bigger hole. But I can say there were a lot of other breaking points many times that Ohio State did something that went wrong. And maybe this is something to touch on. Ohio State did a lot of things wrong or had a lot of things that they needed to do better that could have made the game go their way. And Clemson had a handful of plays that were big plays that made them win. And in my view, this game kind of resembled a lot like Clemson's loss in 2015 to Alabama, where they kind of outplayed Alabama for most of that game and lost anyway because Alabama hit these like 4 big shot plays. And you can talk about whether it's a function of the offense or not, but it also definitely felt like, one team hit a handful of explosive plays when it mattered. Another team really never hit the explosive plays and importantly didn't score in the red zone and squandered what was an otherwise better statistical day because they didn't make any of the plays that really resulted in points.
A couple of things there. One, yes, they did let Clemson drive a little bit, then got the targeting penalty. But then that targeting penalty had a compounding effect because they immediately went after the guy that replaced him and got the pass interference penalty, which really put him in scoring position. The other thing is, I want you to touch on this, and this is where if I've got a concern for Clemson going into the LSU game, it's I wonder if we're a little bit concerned about the fact that Clemson won this game while benefiting not just by a bad holding call or non-call here or there. They benefited tremendously by a lot of things that were entirely outside of their control and entirely unforced. Roughing the kicker is generally roughing punters, generally unforced. Targeting, Clemson didn't do anything to earn that targeting penalty. That wasn't because Clemson is good. That wasn't because the crowd made a guy get a false start. It wasn't because they were killing the guys, on press man coverage and they had to do a pass interference because he got beat. This was just an unforced error that had a huge momentum swing, led to their first score. Same with the fumble. Clemson didn't do anything for that penalty to be overturned. It wasn't because of Clemson's good that any of these 3 things happened. It was because of just really bad luck on Ohio State's part. So is there some concern in a game against an LSU or somebody like that? And I don't want to get into our previews too much, but is there some concern that a lot of what went right for Clemson in this game had nothing to do with how good or bad Clemson was?
I think the answer has to be yes in a way. When you say luck, I don't think the targeting was luck. But your point here is really.
Well, I didn't say luck. I'm basically saying the things that happened that were huge breaks for Clemson weren't breaks that they earned. Like a lot of times you see a huge delay a game or false start on a play in the red zone because you're in a road environment and it's really loud. Or you have corners that can't keep up with your wide receivers, so they're getting pass interference penalties. None of these things. It's almost like when a guy kicks a kickoff out of bounds. That's not because you're good. That's some fluke thing that happened that you benefited from that wasn't earned because you were good. Now you can get super meta on me and say that Clemson's so good and put so much mental pressure on them that it made them rough the kicker or it made them do the targeting. But I think that's going a little too far.
Well, I'd agree with it, but I think, I kind of wanted to make you restate it so that people understood it. The point here is that Clemson wasn't responsible in any way for a lot of the things that happened that helped them win this game. And because you're not responsible for it, it's not something that we can use in terms of something that's going to repeat itself or something that's predictable for how a future game is going to go. If we were looking at this game in an objective lens and we say you repeat it, the odds of these events happening are fairly low. Now, maybe this is something that Ohio State does more often than not, but it's probably not going to be something that every team does. And importantly, things like, roughing the kicker, that's completely an error by Ohio State, not a good play for Clemson. Now, Clemson makes errors as well. Now, they didn't throw an interception in this game. They didn't lose a fumble in this game. No turnovers from Clemson, which I think probably one of the more underrated points is that, they were +2 in the turnover margin. Those things, an interception is forced, and a roughing the kicker is not. And in the targeting foul, that was essentially a turnover because that was going to be a punt. And what's, I think, worse in its own way from a predictive sense is that's a negative play for Clemson where they have an unblocked guy where Ohio State makes a positive play and turn it into a massively negative play through an unforced mental error. And that's the kind of thing that's not really repeatable. So, it's not concerning like Clemson's going to lose because Ohio State did things wrong. I mean, that's not the logic here. The point here is it makes you a little skittish to walk away from this and say, well, Clemson's clearly the best team because they won a game in which things went wrong, which caused them to win, when comparing them to a third party. And we always make this point when we were doing our ratings or our top 10 rankings throughout the year, that when you beat a team, you do kind of have to play the game of you beat them, so you're better than them when you're comparing the two, but not when you're comparing with someone else. And that's the problem here. When Auburn played Oregon and Auburn beat Oregon, if they're equally matched, you do kind of have to say Auburn's better than Oregon because they beat them. But when you're trying to predict if Auburn is going to beat LSU or if Oregon is going to beat Utah, Auburn beating Oregon didn't keep Oregon from beating the ever-loving crap out of Utah. Clemson beating Ohio State doesn't necessarily mean that Ohio State wouldn't have a better chance of beating LSU. And I'm not saying they do or don't. There may be an argument for it due to matchups a little bit, due to the, pass rush and the zone read offense and the issues that LSU had against that. But it doesn't mean they're better than Clemson. We know that Clemson won the game, but you take all that and then you combine it with the fact that you have a game where a lot of really unforced things happen in Clemson's favor. Clemson can't produce roughing the kickers. They can't produce stupid targeting penalties from their opponents. So that does you have to almost take it in like a little notch or two away from statistical analysis in a positive sense from Clemson, because you say, okay, they got to this point and then they were given a couple things by their opponent, and that got them to the point where they're able to get 29 points.
It's like they needed every bit of all of those mental mistakes or refereeing mistakes to get to where they got a 29-23 win.
And since we're already on the negative train and we're 30 minutes in, so the fair weather fans have probably bailed on us already. But and since we're already making people mad because we're talking negative, and that's what we have to do sometimes when you're nitpicking at this level of football, we can get to another point. Okay, Clemson had big plays that broke this game open, and they had it at key moments, and that's a part of their offense and style of football. But it took that to get to 29, and there's 2 points that are notable out of that, and I'll want to say a little bit about it, and then want to let you comment so you have a chance to speak. The first is those big plays came from uncharacteristic chunks from Clemson. We already touched on the fact that Etienne was not an overly effective runner, but I think you also have to be careful in talking about how effective Trevor Lawrence was in the whole. He had one awesome run for 67 yards. It was an incredible play from a quarterback. Outside that run, he was 15 carries for 40 yards, okay? And as a whole from the team, outside the one super long run from Trevor Lawrence, they went 91 yards on 28 carries, which is 3.25 yards per carry. Totally ineffective. And what I think is interesting is they outgained our model at 5.4 yards per carry and predicted to have 4.1, but outside one play, they were actually well under our model. From an efficiency sense, they were atrocious in that game. But from a production sense, they were good because of explosive plays. Same things happens in the passing game, like Etienne with a 53-yard long reception. He had a couple long receptions. But outside that, Justin Ross was actually under 10 yards per reception. T. Higgins was under 10 yards per reception. Yeah, they were banged up and out of the lineup, but even when they were in, they were averaging 8 yards per catch. And 8 yards per catch is not good. You want to be over 10 yards per reception. Again, you take out the 53-yard long from Trevor Lawrence, and he's like 6 yards per attempt. The efficiency numbers were bad. It's just that they had really good explosive numbers, but only just enough to get 29, which slips to my second point. Ohio State really needed more than 23. And so I think the next part of this discussion, and I'll let you talk on it, and then I can go back and give my take, is what caused positive from Clemson, negative from Ohio State. The real name of this game to me is Ohio State only scoring 23 points and being under our model's projection. Because I think that the thing that caused this game to go in Clemson's favor is really not Clemson finding offense. They found just enough to get 29. The thing that happened is that Clemson's defense held Ohio State to 23, because you don't win many games against top-level teams if you can't score 25 points or more.
So, yeah, I mean, we've seen this outside of the one championship game last year where Alabama scored 16. I think they would have, if they weren't feeling the pressure of needing to score a whole bunch, they could have gotten to 30. They certainly produced the stats for it. They still would have lost the game. But we don't see offenses win these types of games not getting to 30, even against really good defenses. So, again, and I don't want to sound like a Clemson hater, but they also benefited from the fact that Ohio State had to run a different offense, given that Fields was clearly not 100%. 0.9 yards per carry, not able to have him be what is normally a key piece of that offense that even opens up the passing game is his threat to run. And you saw a couple, and that was my concern early in the game, was they were moving the ball on Ohio State, but it was because of huge chunk runs from Dobbins and the one chunk run from Fields. But it was pretty clear. If it was clear to us that Fields wasn't there completely as a runner, then it was clearly clear to Brent Venables that they could defend a little bit differently. I will say one of the things that Clemson did do that has proven to be repeatable is red zone defense. They just do not give up touchdowns in the red zone. They didn't do it at Alabama. They didn't do it at Notre Dame last year. They've just been really good in that regard. But there is a huge concern for me offensively in this game. If I'm Ohio State and I have to game plan around a knee for my running quarterback, that doesn't work very well. They were able to manufacture points a lot because of those handful of big runs. But one of the points that we discussed before this was, you said on Twitter last night, I think it was around the 10-minute mark when Ohio State scored their last touchdown, that they should have gone for two to take it to a 3-point lead instead of a 2-point lead. And I, in my gut, didn't love it because I don't like chasing points with 10 minutes to go. I think there's so much football that can happen in so many different scenarios that chasing those points that early is a little tough. I also think because Fields isn't, running 100%, that most of their red zone 2-yard score, 3-yard out score plays might be because of him might go through him running the ball. But one of the things I said to you during the game was, I think it was on the next to last drive Ohio State had. I think that they had 4th and 3, 4th and 4 on around the Clemson 30-yard line. This is all from memory. And I felt like they should have gone for it. But you talked about why not going for 2 put them in a bind there. So I want you to kind of run with that a little bit, set things up for how this was. 4th and 3, 4th and 4. They punted because, and I'll turn it over to you.
So it's 4th and 4 in the Clemson 39. There's 3 minutes and 7 seconds left in the game. And at that point, it's 23-21. So Ohio State had scored the touchdown on their prior possession, forced a punt after 4 plays, driven down, ran the clock down to about 3 minutes. In those situations, there's a strong school of thought, and we're not too far off from this, that if you're deep in opponent territory and you have a chance to get a first down, it's so beneficial to get the first down that you almost have to take it. Because if you can get the first down there, you can bleed almost the entirety of the clock off. And you maybe one first down and you win the game. So you don't have to score. You just got to get 4 yards, and you treat it like a 4th and goal play to win the game. And if you don't get it, the other team still has to score. But the problem with that calculus is it shifts depending on the situation you're in and what you have to keep them from scoring. You're up 2 points. And when on the Clemson 39, if Ohio State had not gotten the first down, then Clemson can just get from the Clemson, 40-yard line to maybe the opposing 30 or 20 and kick a field goal and win the game. So Clemson only needs 30 yards to do that. 30, 40, 30, 40 yards is all it's going to take. 30-yard line's only 30 yards away. So you can't really afford to go for it on fourth down because it's too easy to get 30 yards. If they were in a position where a field goal would have tied the game, I think you're a lot more comfortable to say, all right, we're going to try to go for it. If we don't go for it, we've got a chance to stop them with 3 minutes left. And if we stop them, they don't win. Worst case, they probably kick a field goal because they're not going to march the length. They've got 3 minutes to march the length of the field. We think we can keep them from doing that in 3 minutes, but they can kick a field goal and tie. That's a risk we're willing to take in order to get the first down. But I think the 2-point spread really took that away from them. I think the 2-point spread meant we can't afford to let them kick a field goal. So they no longer had the option to take the risk of giving the ball on the 39-yard line. So they had to punt the ball. And so that let Clemson get the ball back and score. So I think the 2-point conversion, even though a lot of people look at it and look at the final result and say it wasn't important, I actually think it really was because of that moment. And I'm not saying they wouldn't have gotten the first down, but if they do, there's a very, very good shot they win the football game. To talk about really, say it's a shot to win the football game, this is how close the game was, right? That one play may have won it for Ohio State. And moreover, the punt hits Darian Kendrick in the back, and he happens to turn around and fall on it. So you want to talk about a game that was down to the wire? If that ball hits him in the back and bounces a different way and goes to an Ohio State player where they get the ball in the 4 and they go up 30-21, there's no way Clemson's going to score 2 touchdowns on 3 minutes because onside kicks are almost impossible under the new rules. So, yeah, it was a brutally close game. It was a game of inches. The 2-point conversion was a pretty significant thing. And in terms of things that Ohio State had control over, that may have actually really impacted the game, changed what they were able to do strategically at the end of the game. And I won't say lost it for them, but you want to talk about a million things that could have gone your way. Again, a game that's decided by 6 points, there are probably 10 to 15 plays in this game where you can say we lost the game, quote unquote, on that play. Now, the other team always gets a chance to respond, so it's never as clear-cut as you think. But there's a million things that could have happened to allow Ohio State to win. There's also some things that could have allowed Clemson to win more. But that's another example. And that was certainly something that I think was maybe a coaching mental error that was within their control.
As Pat Dye is credited as saying, and maybe by Alabama fans, Auburn fans, let me know if he actually said this. Hindsight's 50-50. That's it, y'all, for our review of this game. Great season for Ohio State. Clemson moving on to the next round. We are obviously going to do a preview of Clemson and LSU. We are also going to talk about LSU Oklahoma if y'all want to take a look for that video as well. I think the preview for Clemson LSU is going to drop next Monday, so we want to give some time for the other bowls to come through, see how the conferences are doing before we record that preview. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.